Welcome to Bodhi Unified Flow. Here, we're all about simplifying complexity and amplifying your performance. Today, we're diving into a really specific, honestly game-changing aspect of your day-to-day life, calibrating your habits using the raw power of neuroscience. We're going to explore the foundations of behavioral change, specifically focusing on how to construct a rock-solid daily practice by reviewing what we call the small scope. We'll look at how to assess your actual progress, and, this is absolutely crucial, how to adjust your daily practice anchor when things, well, just aren't clicking. If you've ever struggled to make a new routine stick, this explainer is going to reveal exactly why that happens and, more importantly, how your brain is quite literally wired to fix it.
Okay, let's take a quick look at our roadmap for this explainer. First, the small scope defined. Second, assessing behavioral progress. Third, the neuroscience of consistency. Fourth, adjusting the daily anchor. Fifth, adaptive learning integration. And finally, we'll wrap up with a summary and our references.
All right, jumping right into Section 1, the small scope defined, breaking down behavior.
So, what are you actually going to walk away with today? Well, by the end of this explainer, you're going to master the concept of the small scope and micro habits. You'll learn how to objectively track your behavioral shifts over time. We're also going to unpack the neuroscience of consistency, specifically how a part of your brain called the basal ganglia automates your life. You'll learn to apply habit stacking so you can adjust your daily behavioral anchors safely and easily. And finally, you'll see how to integrate adaptive learning to pretty much guarantee your continuous improvement. These are actionable, neuroscience-backed strategies ready to go.
To really grasp the small scope, we first need to talk about a concept called backchaining. This is a brilliant behavioral technique where you break a desired behavior down into its absolute tiniest component parts. You literally start at your final goal and work backward until you hit a starting point that is incredibly easy and obvious. For example, let's say your goal is to listen to a 5-minute guided visualization every single morning. For a lot of people, jumping straight into 5 minutes is actually too big of a step. It creates friction. Backchaining means you break it down. Your starting point might just be listening to a single 5-second chime once a day. That's it. It's easy, it's definable, and there's no excuse not to do it. From that tiny anchor, you naturally work your way back up to the full audio.
You know, what's really fascinating here is this heavy emphasis on splitting behaviors rather than lumping them together. Think about it. When you lump a behavior, like telling yourself, I'm going to hit the gym and work out for a full hour every day, you're instantly creating this massive cognitive load. Your brain looks at that and goes, nope, too hard, and triggers resistance. Behavioral experts understand that the real magic isn't splitting. It's about breaking things down so intensely that the action takes almost zero effort. We're talking about micro actions, like just touching your running shoes, or simply putting your earbuds on the desk. If a habit isn't sticking for you, you probably just haven't split it down far enough.
Moving on to Section 2, assessing behavioral progress, the absolute necessity of monitoring.
If we draw from advanced behavioral change programming, the kind used in really high-stakes environments, we realize we have to treat our daily practice like a formal intervention. And that requires monitoring and evaluation, or M&E. This means developing highly precise indicators to measure your outcomes and tracking those shifts completely objectively over time. Let's get one thing straight right now. If you miss a day, it is not a moral failure. It is simply real-time data. You take that feedback, you loop it back into your daily system, and you use it to refine and improve the behavior. Assessing your progress has to be a totally objective, data-driven process. Leave the emotional judgment at the door.
So how do we actually evaluate where our current practice stands? It's pretty straightforward when we contrast a stagnant, failing habit with a successful, adaptive one. Let's look at cognitive load. A stagnant habit requires a ton of high-level effort from your prefrontal cortex. An adaptive one? Super low effort. It's totally automated by your basal ganglia. A stagnant habit gives you low or totally inconsistent dopamine release, whereas an adaptive habit actually triggers a dopamine hit just from the anticipation of doing it. If your environmental cue is vague, like, I'll do it sometime after lunch, and the friction is high, you've got a stagnant habit on your hands. What we're aiming for are explicit, rock-solid cues and microscope, effortless friction.
Okay, on to Section 3, the neuroscience of consistency. Let's talk about rewiring the brain. This brings us to the absolute bedrock of human behavioral change, Hebbian plasticity. Named after the neuropsychologist Donald Hebb, it's the principle that what fires together, wires together. When you repeat an action, especially when it's attached to a specific environmental cue, you are literally, physically rewiring your brain's associative networks. Things that we do become things that we do again and again and again. This neuroplasticity is the fundamental biological reason why microhabits are so effective. Because they are so small, they lower the threshold for action, allowing you to consistently fire those neurons without completely exhausting yourself.
Let's peel back the layers and look at the brain's structures involved here. When you start any new routine, you're heavily relying on your prefrontal cortex. That's the CEO of your brain, responsible for conscious decision-making and self-control. But here's the catch. Using the prefrontal cortex is exactly like pushing a massive boulder up a really steep hill. It takes immense cognitive effort and it drains your energy fast. But as you assess your progress over time, what you're actually tracking is the migration of that behavior. You want it to move from the high-effort prefrontal cortex down to the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia are these deep subcortical structures that encode routines and automate your life. Once a habit takes root in the basal ganglia, pushing that boulder turns into just tapping it and watching it slide effortlessly downhill, completely driven by dopamine. It becomes as thoughtless and automatic as brushing your teeth.
But for the basal ganglia to actually take over and automate the process, the habit has to be rewarding. It absolutely must trigger neurochemical reinforcers. We've got dopamine, which gives you that feeling of, I got it. It's driven by achievement and the anticipation of a reward. Then there are endorphins, which shout, I did it, giving you that rush of physical exhilaration. Serotonin steps in with a sense of pride, whispering, I'm the best, which is often linked to social approval. And oxytocin signals, I'm loved, which deepens our sense of connection. Now keep in mind, these reinforcers are incredibly unique to you. While someone might find a piece of dark chocolate highly rewarding, someone else might surprisingly be motivated by a spoonful of Marmite. Hey, we're all wired differently. The key is, you have to find what authentically triggers your own neurochemistry to make the habit stick.
Which brings us to Section 4, Adjusting the Daily Anchor, Dynamic Calibration.
So now that we know how to look at the data and we understand the brain structures running the show, what do we actually do when our progress stalls? Well, we use a highly effective technique called habit stacking. Here is the step-by-step. First, you need to identify a stable, existing behavioral cue, something you already do every single day without even thinking about it, like pouring your morning cup of coffee. Second, assess the friction of the new action you want to add and minimize it. Shrink it right down to the small scope. Third, attach that tiny new micro-routine directly to the old cue. And finally, secure a meaningful reward, whether intrinsic or extrinsic. By leveraging those already existing associative networks in the basal ganglia, you're essentially just piggybacking the new behavior onto an already hardwired neural pathway. Honestly, it is the safest, most efficient way to adjust your daily anchor.
To put this into perspective, let's compare the two approaches. The failing anchor is what happens when you attempt a massive routine change all at once. It immediately triggers resistance, completely drains your prefrontal cortex, and because it's so difficult to complete, it lacks any immediate neurochemical reinforcement. You burn out. Conversely, the adjusted anchor dials the behavior all the way back to the smallest possible microhabit. It piggybacks on a routine you're already doing, it drastically lowers the threshold to actually get started, and it practically guarantees a quick dopamine hit. Why does this matter? Because if your daily practice is failing, you shouldn't abandon it, and you definitely shouldn't beat yourself up over it. Just shrink the scope and adjust the anchor point.
Almost at the finish line. Section 5, Adaptive Learning Integration, the Loop of Continuous Growth.
You see, a truly successful daily practice is never actually finished. It's a dynamic, living system. And like any living system, it requires adaptive learning and constant iteration. This means setting up adaptive management loops. You take the real-time data you've gathered from your successes and your missed days, and you use it to adjust your interventions dynamically. You have to ensure flexibility in your program design. If a cue stops working for you, no problem, just change it. Strengthen those learning loops for continuous improvement. But above all else, you have to embrace consistency over perfection. I can't stress this enough. A 5-minute daily micro-habit is vastly more effective for creating positive neuroplasticity than a sporadic, exhausting 1-hour session that you only do once a week.
And finally, Section 6, Summary and References. Let's synthesize what we've learned in this explainer.
All right, here are your major takeaways. First, never forget the power of the small scope. Microhabits and backchaining drastically lower the barrier to entry, which completely prevents prefrontal cortex burnout. Second, treat your habits like data. Use objective monitoring and evaluation to track the shift of your habit from conscious, heavy effort to automatic basal ganglia execution. Third, if you hit a wall, and you will, use habit stacking to seamlessly move and adjust your behavioral anchors. And finally, trust the biology. Hebbian plasticity guarantees that consistent, rewarded actions will eventually become completely effortless. You now have the practical, science-backed tools to construct and adjust a truly bulletproof daily practice.
I want to leave you with a provocative thought to chew on. If what fires together wires together, what is the absolute smallest, easiest component of your daily practice that you can adjust, stack onto an existing cue, and successfully fire today? Seriously, don't wait for tomorrow. Shrink the scope and fire that neural pathway right now.
Thank you so much for hanging out with us today at Bodhi Unified Flow. The insights we explored in this explainer were drawn from some incredibly grounded sources, including the Upskill Development Institute's Advanced Behavioral Change Programming course, Chromosome V's deep dive into the neuroscience of habit formation, and the fantastic work by Accidental Gods on the nature of habits. Keep adjusting those anchors, keep learning, and we'll catch you in the next explainer.